All right. Well, hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for the webinar. So welcome to our webinar series hosted by the North Central Climate Adaptation Science Center, also known as the NCCASC. We are based in Boulder at the University of Colorado. My name is Heather Yoakum, and I am the Stakeholder Engagement Lead here at the NCCASC. And I co-organized this webinar series with my colleague, Imtiaz Ringwala, who is the Climate Science Lead here at the CASC. And so we bring you these monthly webinars to facilitate a discussion of science and research and best practices related to resource management and climate adaptation. And we focus here at the NCCASC on the North Central US, which for us means the states of Kansas, Nebraska, South Dakota, North Dakota, Montana, Wyoming, and Colorado. And so before I introduce our speakers for today, just a quick word on housekeeping and logistics. So we are recording this webinar, and you can find all of our webinar recordings on our website, and I'll post the link to that in the chat in just a couple of moments. And during the webinar, all participants will be muted, so you can submit your questions and comments throughout or during the webinar in the chat box, and I'll be monitoring that. And then at the end of the presentation, we'll start with those questions and comments during the Q&A. And then after we've posed those to our speakers, time permitting, will allow you to unmute yourselves and ask questions directly. So now it is my pleasure to introduce our two speakers for today, Paul Day and Molly Cross. Paul Day is the Aquatic Habitat Manager or Program Manager for the Wyoming Game and Fish Department. In his role, he facilitates a team of 12 agency biologists in implementing stream restoration, fish passage, and water management projects to improve stream functions and aquatic resources. And Molly Cross is a climate change adaptation scientist for the Wildlife Conservation Society, or WCS. And her work brings together researchers and conservation practitioners to incorporate climate change science in on-the-ground conservation goals and actions. She is also the Director of Science for the WCS Climate Adaptation Fund, which supports applied projects demonstrating on-the-ground interventions for wildlife adaptation to climate change in the US. So thank you very much to both of you for joining us and telling us more about your work today. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Polly, oh my Lord, Molly and Paul.
Thanks so much, Heather. Thanks so much for the invitation to present today, and thanks to everybody for coming. I'm going to kick things off a little bit, but it's a real honor to get to co-present this talk with Paul. He and I have had a really good time working together over the last year or two, and so it's nice that in this presentation you'll get to hear sort of both of our voices, both of our perspectives on the project. I'll kick things off with a bit of a background and introduction to the work, and then, like I said, Paul and I will tag team a bit over the course of the presentation. So this project was funded by the North Central Climate Adaptation Science Center, and it was driven by our interest in supporting actionable climate science. And as part of that, we wanted to learn more about timely climate science needs for upcoming decision-making by state fish and wildlife agencies in the region. And so the first phase of this project was to interview state fish and wildlife managers in the North Central region. These interviews were led by Dr. Shelley Crosby, who's on the call today from Conservation Science Partners. And from those interviews, we honed in on a number of topics of interest to a large number of agencies in the region. And climate change impacts on river systems was one of those. As well as also identifying specific upcoming planning or decision-making opportunities that we could support in phase 2 of this project. So I'll be talking today about that phase 2. And in this phase of the project, we had 3 goals. The first was to work with and collaborate with a state fish and wildlife agency to co-produce climate-related information that they could use in specific upcoming management planning. While the second goal, simultaneously identifying management relevant, or what we sometimes call salient, climate information gaps and needs that could be filled by future research investments by the North Central CASC or others. And then lastly, the third goal of the project was to learn about the process of co-production of climate information by evaluating project activities and sharing that learning. So that brings us to this presentation today, where we want to share with you what we accomplished in this project and what we learned from it. So early on, as I mentioned, Shelley did these interviews, and from those interviews, we learned that the Wyoming Game and Fish Department was planning an update to their statewide habitat plan. And so after a few initial conversations with Paul and then some follow-up conversations with more of his colleagues at the department, we decided to focus the second phase of the project on a collaboration with the Wyoming Game and Fish Department related to the update of their statewide habitat plan, which was taking course over the course of the year in 2020. So I want to turn it over to Paul so he can say hello and also tell you a little bit more about the Wyoming statewide habitat plan and what their motivation for wanting to do this work to incorporate climate change in the update.
Yeah, so thanks, Molly. And as Molly mentioned, this collaboration opportunity came at a really good time. We were just starting out to plan an update to what is one of our department's most used and relevant plans, that is our statewide habitat plan. We call it our SHIP, SHP, and this plan outlines priorities for habitat protection and restoration work. Generally, we run in 5-year intervals on this plan. By way of background, our first version of a SHIP plan was done in 2001, and it was motivated primarily by a need to get different sections and divisions from across our agency to work together better, frankly. We had folks going a lot of different directions, sometimes completely unaware of other work. Might sound like some agencies you all are familiar with. So we started the planning process as a way to get everyone pulling together, and this idea of rallying around a plan was successful enough back in 2001 that we've been updating it periodically ever since. And when I say we, I mean a team of managers at Game and Fish. We have a team we call the HTAG, Habitat Technical Advisory Group. Just think of it, the Habitat team. And we're responsible for plan implementation. And our team members come from different habitat related programs throughout the department. So they have the ability to see that plan elements are actually tackled. And so we were responsible for creating the latest revision. Finally, I should point out that this SHIP plan is a parallel plan to our state wildlife action plan. And you might rightly ask why we even have this plan. Why not just have a swap? And we've certainly debated that question, but have come down on the side of keeping both plans. Our staff and biologists are comfortable and familiar with the SHIP, which, by the way, preceded our swap by a few years. And it has a track record of being useful, and it's free of federal expectations. That's in there somewhere. The swap is very comprehensive, of course, and has portions that overlap our SHIP, including the acronyms, but it focuses on other issues and species related information. So anyway, as we discussed our plan revision, we talked about how the plan would absolutely need to address climate change just to be relevant. And around that time, we were hearing from the North Central Climate Adaptation Science Center. And I don't remember if we got in touch with Molly or she got in touch with us, but we connected and the timing was good. And, overall, the facilitation provided by Molly helped us on a big piece of this planning process. And of course, the plan revision included other aspects not related to climate change, but rolling in climate change was a big aspect, a big lift, and we knew we needed help to know where to start. So I guess back to Molly to describe how we tackled that.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. So yeah, like Paul mentioned, the timing really was perfect for this project. And so one of the first things we did, in line with kind of the literature and guidance on how to try to co-produce information with information providers and information users, we started by being really clear and explicit about what the shared goals were for the collaboration with myself and the Wyoming Game and Fish Department. And so all along this presentation, I'm going to share with you sometimes a little bit of the nuts and bolts of some of the methods we used, because partly the goal of the project was to be testing and evaluating the effectiveness of specific methods. So, I'll drop those nuggets along the way. And so, for example, at the beginning of the project, I conducted one-on-one interviews with a core team at Wyoming Game and Fish Department, a 6-person team from within that HTAG, Habitat Technical Advisory Group that Paul mentioned. And that core team of 6 managers at the department were, the core group that I've worked with throughout this project. And so I did one-on-one interviews with each of them individually, and then we stepped back and looked at what came out of those individual discussions to agree together as a group of what the goals were for this project. And so there were several. We tried to accomplish a lot in this project, and I think we made some good strides on most of these, as we'll talk about over the course of the presentation. The first was around helping the department increase their knowledge of climate change impacts, of climate-informed planning approaches and specific adaptation strategies and actions, as well as help them increase their knowledge and connections to relevant climate change experts in the region. A big part was to incorporate climate-informed actions into the statewide habitat plan, as well as I mentioned earlier, identify some management-relevant gaps in climate information, or at least information that the agency knows of right now, that could be helpful to their decisions in the future. And then the last one being about, I was quite grateful that my colleagues at Wyoming Game and Fish Department were willing to engage in this effort to not only do the work together, but also try to evaluate and learn from it. So having agreed to those goals, we worked together throughout the whole project to develop the different sort of steps in the process and steps in the project. I came in with some background and experience in running climate-informed planning efforts, but I want to emphasize that we co-developed all of the different activities along the way with a specific eye towards how to make this project directly useful to the statewide habitat plan update. So again, just to talk a little bit about some of the process and the methods, we began by really clarifying and better understanding, making sure we had the decision context, or in this case, the plan context, front and center in our thinking about the project. So I reviewed the previous plan to get a feel for what kinds of information has been included in the past, had many discussions with Paul and his colleagues with that core team to make sure I understood, what was needed for this specific plan. In addition, we started to talk about, at least in a broad sense, how we think climate change could be relevant to the plan. And in particular, we chose to focus in on river and riparian and associated wetland habitats for this project, rather than trying to bite off all the different habitats covered in the statewide habitat plan, at least focus in on those river systems. So again, we had some conversations with various climate experts in the region, and then I worked closely with NCCASC at the North Central CASC to summarize and synthesize some of the best available climate projections for the region, which we then incorporated into a participatory climate change planning workshop, which was the core activity in which we co-produced climate-related information and climate-informed actions, as well as identify those information gaps and needs. We also, as I'll talk about more later, conducted some online surveys in association with that workshop, both to evaluate the workshop's effectiveness, but also to hone our understanding of those information gaps. And so then the next step was to actually help the agency use that information in that near-term planning process. And we did this, again, collaboratively, having lots and lots of meetings, even after the workshop. I'm not sure we all realized just how many meetings were going to be needed after the workshop, even more than before the workshop and planning it. And so that's where, we really pulled together the information from the workshop and tried to make it as useful as possible. But then the agency, as I'll talk more about later, chose the ways in which they decided to incorporate that into the plan. And then lastly, we stepped back at the end of the project to try to evaluate what worked well. And we did that through, and kind of what the outcomes were. How did the information get incorporated into the plan? So we'll talk a little bit about some of the document analysis we did of the 2020 Statewide Habitat Plan, as well as some interviews that my colleagues at WCS led with Paul and his colleagues on the core team. So again, just a little bit of the nuts and bolts to give you a feel for what this project looked like. I want to talk a bit more about the climate change planning workshop, since that participatory workshop was really kind of a core piece and a core place in which the kind of co-production happened. We were originally planning for it to be in person, so of course had to convert to a virtual setting in 2020. And in the end, as we'll talk about more, I think that actually worked pretty well for what we needed, and maybe even better than we anticipated. But the goals of the workshop were to share information about the best available climate change projections that are relevant to river, riparian, and wetland habitats in the state, explore the ecological consequences of those climate changes, and then identify climate-informed habitat protection and restoration actions that were relevant to the SHIP. And then lastly, try to get at some of those gaps in information, or at least identifying what kinds of information would be useful to future decisions. One of the benefits, I think, to having this workshop be virtual was that we had very high participation, higher numbers than we would have anticipated for an in-person workshop. And so depended on the session and the day, but over the course of 2.5 days, we had anywhere from 25 up to even 55 staff from Wyoming Game and Fish Department participating in this meeting. And then we had about a dozen external climate experts who participated as well. And again, we did this with upfront a 3-hour webinar where we had some climate science presentations, but then 2 full days of much more interactive breakout discussions. And those breakouts focused on some different geographies in the state to try to touch on a range of different habitat issues that are relevant for the SHIP. One of the other things we did, in part because it was virtual, that again, I think we thought worked really well, is we utilized online Google Docs to gather information and to sort of document the information as we discussed it and generated it. So this is just an excerpt from one of those Google Doc worksheets. On the left-hand side, we have information about the climate projections that NCCASC compiled in advance of the workshop. And then in this column on the far right is sort of the information that was co-produced by the participating staff at Wyoming Game and Fish Department, as well as the external climate change researchers. So again, these were opportunities where people could offer comments verbally, but also type their thoughts and ideas into the document directly. And as we'll touch on towards the end of the presentation, we really think that had the effect of engaging everybody really well and gathering a ton of information, way more than I have gathered in workshops where we are, using flip charts in person. So over the course of this workshop, we co-produced a lot of information, maybe lots and lots of information that at times was challenging to know what to do with it all. We identified around 70 or over 70 different climate change impacts of concern, 75 different management actions that could help address those climate change impacts. And then we kind of grouped them a little bit, but ended up with about 44 statements of information that the agency could use to make climate-informed management decisions in the coming years. So again, a lot of information generated by this workshop. So now we want to transition to talking a little bit about how well did this workshop and some follow-up activities that we did kind of help us achieve the goals that we set out for the project. So the rest of this presentation we're going to kind of walk through those goals that I shared at the beginning and kind of go one by one and sort of share a little bit about what, how successful we felt like the project was at achieving different goals. And I'll talk about the first, and then I'll pass it over to Paul to talk a little bit about how the information is actually incorporated into the plan, which is probably the most exciting part of this presentation. So first, I wanted to share. We did surveys both right before and right after, an online survey right before and after the workshop, and asked questions about participants, knowledge of climate change impacts, familiarity with climate-informed actions and planning processes and tools and resources. And then right after the workshop, ask those same questions and ask people to comment on how they felt the workshop maybe increased their knowledge or familiarity with these tools. And again, we had maybe 35. These are just the staff at Wyoming Game and Fish Department who responded to those data I'm showing here. The next several slides have this exact same format. There's the question we asked, which are generally around, in this case, gaining new knowledge about climate change projections and impacts. And you can see almost 90% of the respondents said yes, the workshop, as a result of the workshop, I gained new knowledge. They felt more comfortable integrating climate information into their work, felt more familiar with approaches and tools for climate-informed conservation planning, and more familiar with climate change adaptation strategies or actions that are relevant to their work. So, very, positive information about the value of the workshop and how we were able to tailor it to add value to Wyoming Game and Fish Department staff. And then lastly, we asked this question, we had meet in quotes because of the virtual setting, but did you meet any new individuals with whom you will likely develop or share information about climate science in the future? This was a little bit more mixed. About 50% though said that yes, I met some new individuals. So in terms of speaking to the workshop's ability to help the agency expand their network and of experts that they know they could turn to collaborate with on these issues. So with that, I'm pleased to turn it over to Paul for a little bit to talk about, again, kind of how did that information that we generated at the workshop actually get used directly in the plan?
All right, thanks. So our commission, our Wyoming Game and Fish Department Commission, approved our new plan in the late fall of 2020. And certainly this plan has a strong grounding in climate science. We now, for example, have a standalone climate section in the plan. It's obvious, I think we are essentially out of the closet with the word climate. We've mentioned it, 63 times compared to like once in the previous plan. One of the main features of the plan is a section with specific strategies and actions. And in the process of laying out those strategies and actions, we flagged actions that we felt address climate change at some level. And so out of our 76 some odd actions, 40% were flagged as addressing climate change. And so this is an example from the plan. The red symbol is a fire symbol that we use to flag actions that promote resiliency in the face of climate change. And so I'm just walking through these examples. In some cases, many cases, I'd say, the actions we flagged as being relevant to climate change are things the department is doing, has been doing. For example, action B on this page, on this slide, talks about emphasizing floodplain connectivity for river restoration projects. And that's something we've been doing for many years as we address incised channels being a common affliction of our waterways and networks across the West. But in some cases, the actions we developed were new. For example, action C on this slide focuses on the importance of spring creeks. And previously, we'd not really come to that realization of their importance, and that came directly out of the workshop. And then I guess action A is sort of an example that illustrates a mix of old and new perspectives. We've been building multi-stage channels in stream restoration work to promote resiliency in the face of droughts, and thinking about droughts and floods is not new, but climate change forced us to think about maybe more extreme conditions of higher high flows and lower low flows and changing frequencies thereof. So kind of a mixed bag in how the workshop translated to our actions in the plan. Another key new feature of our plan and approach and overall approach is that we now award a point if an internal department project proposal appears to address climate change. So under this new system, projects are rewarded in scoring for addressing a specific climate change strategy or action, or identifying how resilience will be increased. And so the scoring is done by the same team of managers I mentioned before, the H-tag. So last January of 2021, we did this for the first time and had what I would characterize as mixed results. Project funding applicants rarely included explicit language about how their proposed effort would promote resiliency in the face of climate change. And that was, looking back, that was surely due to a lack of clear guidance and direction. We did not get the word out about the new process, so folks essentially missed it. So our evaluation team decided to still go ahead and make judgments about how well each project functioned to promote resiliency, and we awarded that climate change point to 30 out of 34 projects. Perhaps we're a little bit generous, but for the most part, you can make a valid argument that that ecosystem functional resiliency was being improved. And so we did not attempt to provide detailed guidance for team members on defining what projects to qualify. That was left up to their judgment. So this year, in contrast, we did provide clear guidance to funding applicants via recent email reminders. And so if applicants do not make a case for their proposed work relative to climate considerations, they will score less. They won't get that point this go around. One of the really valuable outcomes of this effort in collaboration with Molly was the generation of a list of info needs for the agency, and Molly's going to cover that topic.
Thanks, Paul. So yeah, again, as we talked about, thinking about the goals of this work, it was trying to do the best we could to incorporate as much information as possible in this near-term planning opportunity that's out before us. But we also wanted to try to utilize the workshop and the general discussions we had about climate change and its impacts to better understand what climate information would be most useful to the agency as they make decisions going forward. And in some cases, that information might exist, but it's not in the hands of the agency or individual managers quite yet. Or in some cases, it might be gaps in available information that would need to be the subject of future research. So as I mentioned, at the workshop, it was this sort of main place where we tried to generate ideas and information from both the managers that were participating as well as the non-agency or non-Wyoming Game and Fish Department climate experts, sort of to ask them, what does the agency need to know in order to make better climate-informed decisions in the next 5 years? And so, as I mentioned earlier, as with every aspect of this workshop, we got a ton of information about those information needs and gaps. And so we lumped and grouped them a little bit, but ended up with 44 statements about information needs that cut across many different themes, from riparian and wetland ecosystem health and the changing climate, looking more specifically at aquatic habitat and fisheries, the need for assessments, climate change vulnerability assessments and analyses of climate refugia, and so on. So lots of different topics came out of those discussions. And so we found this to be, this was really helpful information for the agency. But as we thought about it and talked about it more as a group with the core team at the department, we realized that it would be helpful to get a little bit more information about which of those information needs are seen by managers as most important to their work or most relevant to their work. So a few weeks, or maybe it was even a month or more after the workshop, we developed an online survey that went out to Wyoming Game and Fish Department staff, both people who attended the workshop as well as it actually went out to everybody in the agency, and asked them follow-up questions about how useful these 44 different statements of information needs would be to their work. And so for every single one of those 44, we asked questions. We asked this question, and they could respond, it's not at all useful to my work. slightly useful, moderately useful, very useful. So for every single statement of information needs statement, we were able to gather more information about the usefulness. And then for those questions that were seen as very useful to their work, we asked them additional questions about how they might use this information or what kinds of management decisions would they use it in. So this next slide is one of those classic slides where I tell you like not to look at all the details. There's definitely too much on this slide to read the details. But of the 20, what we got from this survey again was another big plug of information and data. But what we found was that every single one of those 44 statements of information need were seen by at least one manager as being very useful to their work. However, some topics were relatively more useful to more respondents to the survey. I think we had in total about 28 respondents to this survey. And so then we just sort of chose to kind of articulate some different, I don't know, kind of tiers of priority information needs. And so from this information, you can start to whittle it down and say, well, here's a list of 8 information needs that were seen as being useful or very useful to over 60% of the survey respondents. So ones that really maybe rise to the top in terms of being highly relevant to a large number of the survey respondents. So this is, you know, one way to sort of digest this information and could feed back into the agency's thinking about some high priority research that they may choose to invest in with their own research dollars, or how they might actively seek out partnerships with outside researchers who are interested in doing management relevant science. So really all of those 44 information needs, I think, are helpful and useful to thinking about what kind of information managers in the department could use going forward. And then this survey gave us a little bit more nuance to maybe getting at just how important or how many or how often is it going to be very useful to managers' work. So, you know, this is information that's available in the workshop report for researchers in the region who want to do management relevant science. And some of this information has been incorporated into calls for funding proposal or funding calls for proposals from the North Central CASC, and again, are widely available for anyone who wants to see. So this brings me to the last section of the presentation, where we wanted to pause and kind of evaluate the actions, you know, that the project activities, and to get at what about the project seemed most useful to achieving the outcomes that we did with respect to bringing climate information into the statewide habitat plan and generating those information needs. So in addition to the workshop survey that I showed earlier, which gave us some indication about the usefulness to the managers that participated in that workshop, we also, and in addition to the document analysis, the results of which Paul mentioned briefly in terms of looking at the use of the term climate change in the 2020 plan versus the 2015 plan, we also conducted what we're calling kind of our post-project interviews. So this was led by 2 colleagues of mine at WCS. So they were not kind of fundamentally involved in this project along the way, but they came in and developed a post-project interview protocol, and Paul and the 5 other members of the core team we worked with at Wyoming Game and Fish Department kindly agreed to participate in these interviews and share their thoughts and perspectives. And so we focused this on, did you guys, oh, sorry, you probably lost my screen there. Can you still hear me though?
I can still see your slides, and I can also hear you.
Okay, it's probably like frozen on the screen, so it may not advance past this slide
And
until
I just lost your slides.
Okay, well, I can keep talking. You won't see the pretty slides, but it'll connect again in a second, but I'm here on the audio. So we asked the Wyoming Game and Fish Department core team about their perceptions of the project's methods and the value, if any, they saw. Sorry, I'm going to share again. In the booming metropolis of Bozeman, we still have all kinds of internet challenges. Okay.
Looks
You guys
good.
can see those slides again. Okay, great. And then emerging from these interviews, we also talked a little bit about the role that I was able to play as what some people call a boundary actor in these kinds of projects and conversations, somebody who sits in between the information users and the information generators and can help kind of try to bridge those worlds. So I'm going to talk just a little bit more briefly about what we heard in these interviews. So the first slide here, I'll cover just some of the things that came out from these interviews around the process and the methods that we used in this project that were seen as useful to the outcomes. One was that overall, the process, the project created lots of opportunities for Wyoming Game and Fish Department to provide input and to help to co-design and co-create everything we did together. So it really was this kind of collaborative partnership throughout the whole project. It wasn't just that I talked with them a little bit at the beginning and then organized a workshop on my own and came back later. It was really all of us working together very closely. I mean, over the course of a year, we met in advance of the workshop. We were probably meeting every 1 to 2 weeks as we prepared for the workshop from January through April. And then after the workshop, as I mentioned, we met pretty much every 2 weeks for another couple months as we tried to digest the information, do the information needs survey, and follow up with other synthesis and activities that we did together. The workshop format was seen as effective. The fact that it was so participatory, the ways that we utilized these online documents to create opportunities and space for everybody to contribute. So we felt, the staff at Wyoming Game and Fish Department felt that it encouraged inclusivity. And as I mentioned a couple of times, it generated a lot of information that gave them a lot of material to work with, a lot of buy-in and participation that they felt fed into support for what the product was and how climate change showed up in the ship. Our ability to work with NCCASC and bring climate data and climate experts from the region that could make the impacts more tangible and just help to promote better engagement. When climate change information is really too broadly discussed or presented, or you're talking about impacts from other regions, it can be, I think, harder for folks to see the relevancy to their work. And then the process we used to get at some of these higher priority information needs through the survey was seen as helpful to the agency as well. And overall, there were many aspects of the project that the Wyoming Game and Fish Department core team felt were could be replicated by others. And often with that addition of sort of the support of somebody to play a role like I did on the project by being this kind of boundary actor. And so in terms of what about the role that I played, this is a little bit awkward for me to talk about, like, this is what I did in this project and how it was useful, but I'll just ignore that and charge on. But, some of the things that came up in terms of the value of having somebody in my role was just being able to make a real significant time commitment to the project, not just in any one given time over the course of the year in which they were updating the plan, but to be available to help support them in whatever ways they needed over the course of that whole year. That was really important, which obviously from my perspective comes with it the sort of benefits that the fact that I had funding from the North Central CASC to play that role was essential. I was able to bring to the table ideas on methods. So again, I've done a lot of climate informed planning. And so I was able to bring some ideas to the table, but then again, we worked really closely to tailor that and adapt it to what they needed. And then, it was helpful to them to have somebody to kind of continue to keep driving the process, organize those calls, make sure we're meeting every couple of weeks so that we hit the benchmarks that we set out for ourselves in terms of being prepared for the workshop and in terms of, timing the synthesis of the workshop material alongside the timing of their update to the ship. And then, again, I was able to sort of, because of some of my expertise, was relevant enough that I could really contribute to that synthesis and the processing of information. And then lastly, kind of my ability and knowledge of experts in the region to kind of bring those folks to the table. You know, I am not an expert in everything that they needed support on and needed technical information and ideas on, but fortunately, I know a lot of people who are. And so playing that connector role was also seen as very important. And then I just want to pause and add from my own perspective that I appreciated that they saw my role as being helpful, but I would argue that it is still absolutely not sufficient. And from my perspective, the true outcomes from this project were really dependent on the level of engagement that Wyoming Game and Fish Department had throughout the whole project. So, you know, there are, I think, situations where an agency might bring in an outside consultant to help them, you know, bring climate information into a particular plan or project. But I think that really what was so great about this work was that they were there and present throughout that whole year, committed to doing this sometimes challenging work to figure out how climate change fits into their plan and how to incorporate it. And, you know, that's not something that somebody can do from the outside alone. So the leadership that Paul showed, the leadership that this HTAG, this Habitat Technical Advisory Group showed, and their commitment to bringing climate information into the plan is ultimately what led to the plan that they have today. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Paul to share just some of his kind of closing thoughts on the project as well before we open it up for questions.
Yeah, thanks, Molly. You know, I think one of the really valuable take homes for me from this collaboration, and Molly said it, was that we as an agency and as a team really benefited from this paradigm or this setup to have somebody come in, Molly come in as a facilitator and play that boundary actor role, as she terms it. She helped us get started. She connected us to experts. She provided an effective sounding board. She served to stimulate ideas. She organized our energies. And we did a lot of work, but she sure helped make it happen. She helped us maintain momentum. She provided structure, I guess, to our thoughts and actions. And, you know, being an outside expert in such matters, she sort of raised the stakes a little in that we had this commitment and accountability to her and to have a useful product. And I think that is an improvement over, you know, I know it's an improvement, and we would not have had that if we were trying to do it on our own. We found that Zoom worked just as well and in some ways better than in-person meetings. Molly mentioned that. You know, we had freewheeling harvesting of thoughts and ideas from a lot of game and fish folks. You know, going forward, the challenge is to stay engaged with our plan and to follow it. You know, that's really the hard work, and that's going to take continued leadership at all levels and people skills, of course. One of our actions we are doing on our habitat team is we have a standing agenda item to revisit and discuss our progress on various action items from the plan, including the climate related actions. And so just that little process step may help us keep our eyes on the ball, so to speak. I guess with that, our time's starting to run a little short. Better get to the questions. Molly, do you have any last words? Last slide.
Yeah, so thanks, Paul. And I'll leave this up for a moment. This, I think, will probably be captured in the on the website. I think our presentation will presumably be posted there. So if you want to click on the links, you can see the plan and see for yourself how they brought climate change in. You can see our workshop report. And then just want to acknowledge that there's a real great team of folks we were able to work with throughout this whole project, both in the department as well as the WCS and outside colleagues. So thank you very much for coming today. And yeah, we'd be very happy to answer questions. And I don't know if doing so is a little easier if I actually stop sharing my screen.
Great, thank you both very, very much for that. Really interesting, and I just love the work that you both did, and so I love hearing about it because I think it's such such a great example of the work that a lot of the folks that are probably here today and on this call and working in some of these, in the CASC and other related organizations are really trying to do. So thank you both very much for sharing your experience with this. So I'll kick it off with the first question is for Paul. How did you encourage engagement? I need to do some diction practices before I do these. So how did you encourage engagement from the staff, and what tips would you mention for other department or team leads to get participation from your staff in these types of processes?
Right. So, I'm a firm believer, I guess, in the idea or philosophy that if you're not involved in building something, you don't really care as much about it. And I think having a broad and friendly and enticing sort of invitation for folks to become involved in this was the first step. But in making it interesting, timing's important, relative to people's work schedules. We have a pretty tight group in our habitat folks, so we're able to deliver the invitation and the request. But ultimately, kind of getting over that first step and getting folks involved. If they're not involved, that the plan's just another piece of paper, and who cares? It's some boring plan that sits on the shelf. But if you're involved in it and it reflects your thoughts and your energy, it becomes much more meaningful. And I think as I mentioned, going forward, I think we're probably about due for sort of another round of refreshment, on strategizing and talking about where we're at. It's been almost 2 years now. We have every 2 years we have a section-wide habitat get together, and we do things in the field together, and that's a great venue to bring this up again. And maybe we'll get Molly out to reconnect and talk about how we're doing and what next steps are.
Great, thank you. Molly, do you have anything you'd like to add?
No, I was going to just say, I do think a lot of it probably, Paul, is a testament to the fact that the statewide habitat plan is one that is really used. I would imagine that, and that's a bit of like the groundwork you and others and previous folks in these positions before you all kind of built up over the last decade and plus, in terms of making the plan be relevant enough to people's work that they probably engage, and then to ask them to engage in this piece of the update process was maybe again just kind of an incremental ask as opposed to to something that maybe they see as valuable.
Great, thank you. So I'm actually going to insert myself here and ask one of my questions. So you both already talked a little bit, a lot about kind of the process and the engagement at various different stages. But I was wondering if you could kind of put that really explicitly in a timeline for us. Like when did you kind of first start working together, like date wise, and then kind of how long all of those different steps took. So you can kind of give us a sense of the like the timeline, or how long we should think about these types of processes when we're planning them.
Yeah, I can jump in there, and then Paul, you can add any nuance or correct me if I get anything wrong. But the agency obviously had a timeline over which they were updating their plan, and Paul, you can say more about that. But from our conversations, I remember that kind of really ramping up in the fall of 2019. So it was, a full year process. They then got commission approval of the updated plan in November 2020. So, and I'd say probably you really had that plan, drafted, finalized, pending approval by the commission in September to early October, probably, right, of 2020. So the overall, at least the intensive part of your planning process was a little over a year. And then this project, I would say, Paul and I were having some conversations to line things up, but we really kicked things off in January of 2020. So starting really at the beginning of that calendar year, we had our workshop at the end of April. So, it was January, February, March, where we were agreeing on our collaborative goals and then planning that workshop. Again, probably meeting, every 2 weeks to every week in that last month or so before the workshop itself. And then after the workshop, so that was the end of April, in May, in June was a lot of the heavy lifting to really digest all the information from the workshop and to write the workshop report, as well as, again, Paul and his colleagues were thinking about what do we extract, how do we extract this information and plug it into the plan. So, that probably took place a lot in July and August, would be my guess, that work that they did. And then again, it was kind of fully drafted in September, October, and approved by November. So, less than a full year for the collaborative part we worked on together.
Yeah, the only thing I'd add, that's a pretty full explanation, is that our habitat plan has generally been a 5-year instrument, and that seems to be about the right sort of chunk of time to incorporate to, get the new people in different positions and re-engage people and make it meaningful through their re-engagement on the plan, but not make it so frequent that, it seems like we're just constantly turning it over and doing a new plan.
Great. We've got one more question in the chat, and then I will let Andrea Ray make a comment or talk about the comment she made in the chat. So the question is, any thoughts about incorporating criteria for resilience in project proposals, and then developing indicators and metrics for determining the effectiveness of projects at addressing resilience? This is a great question for you, Molly.
Just like, set me up. Pat,
I know
even
it's a hard
you.
one.
And it was
Yeah.
like a perfect, no. So this is something I'm very interested in. I'll say a little bit more about my own perspectives on this, which are separate from kind of how the department is doing this. But with the Climate Adaptation Fund grant program that Heather mentioned in my introduction, the WCS Climate Adaptation Fund is a grant program that is specifically about investing in on-the-ground conservation actions designed to help wildlife and ecosystems adapt to a changing climate. So I'm not going to go into detail about how we approach it in that program, but just to say I would be more than happy to talk with you, Pat, or others who may be interested about kind of how do we evaluate project proposals for their sort of adaptation value, or it's about the intentionality with which they're incorporating climate into the design of their work that they're then proposing to us. And we're also in this program grant program thinking a lot about how do we help support the measuring of effectiveness after implementation. So I won't go into that because I don't want to detract. I want to give Paul a chance to talk a little bit about some of the ways they're wrapping their heads around or the challenges they're facing and trying to kind of define exactly what that might mean in the context of the Wyoming ship.
Yeah, that question really invokes the gold standard in projects in general, trying to really nail it down to measurable metrics, both proposed and what comes out of it. And that's been one of my drums I've often known for beating, is related to that, which is to strive for quantifiable objectives in all of our work, and then to follow through and really assess whether or not and what degree you met or didn't meet those objectives. And that's a hard thing. I've been, struggling to achieve that throughout my career, and had, variable success, I guess. But I think linking project objectives to, one more step in putting a climate lens on relative to those objectives is I think how we can get there. And when we do stream restoration projects, we talk about, are you achieving a bank height ratio of 1, in riffles, i.e. is it connected to the floodplain? Well, then how does that connection to the floodplain relate to a climate resiliency, metric of some sort? That would be kind of where you'd take that.
That's right. It's that importance of that, what some people in like conservation planning call the theory of change, or like a logic chain that says, if we take this action, we expect to see this impact, this effect on the system, ultimately leading into this, quantifiable outcome. And so the same thing applies with climate change projects, is sort of being really clear about that theory of change for how this project will help to help a species or an ecosystem respond or adapt to a changing climate, and then thinking about the indicators you could actually peg to that theory of change along the way. So I think those are kind of general principles that can apply, for both the general conservation, like you said, Paul, general management projects, as well as climate adaptation specifically.
Great, thank you both. So we've got about 2 minutes. Andrea, did you want to say something about that comment?
Sure,
that you dropped in the
I
chat?
wrote it there just so it was already there. Actually, Heather, I'm a co-author with her on this forthcoming Conservation Science and Practice article. And we looked at 10, right, Heather, 10 state wildlife action plans in the North Central. And somebody said earlier in this that the climate was only mentioned maybe 3 times, and not the SWAP, but actually the Wyoming plan. But in the SWAP, we actually ranked well, they weren't ranked, but we scored Wyoming's 2015 SWAP as exemplary in how it used climate information, partly because they just went so much further than some of the other states. And in particular, this really nice article that I wish I had known about at the time, from Passawish. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, from Wyoming Game and Fish, and really nice study. It looked at multiple GCMs instead of just ensembling them. They looked at the different kinds of plausible futures and stuff. So I just wanted to throw out Heather's great new article and just laud the previous SWAP efforts.
Well, certainly we should be in a good place for building on both of these efforts and, be ready for our next version of the SWAP.
Yeah. That's what that article tries to do, is say, here's some things for the next round of swaps. So thanks.
Cool.
Yeah, and I can't wait to see more of the stuff on criteria for resilience, like really a tough nut to decide.
I think that is going to be very interesting coming up, because I feel like, for the RESAs, resilience was a really key thing that the whole program is sort of trying to turn itself towards. And considering they're kind of a sister program of the CASC, I think it, bears mentioning, and, the increased interest in thinking about adaptation and critically thinking about adaptation and how we measure it and how we think about it moving forward, I think is a really great new kind of horizon that all of us are sort of coming to and working on. So, and
I can imagine that they're going to be different criteria for different kinds of contexts. So not, as so many things, not a one size fits all. Thanks, Molly. This is terrific.
Yeah, and with that, I'm gonna call it, since we've only got 2 minutes to the hour. But thank you very, very much, Molly and Paul. I really appreciate you being here today. Thank you. So bye, everyone. Have a great day and stay warm.
Thanks so much.